guys, I'm going to read The Mice of St Goran, which is this book, and I read it to Zachy and Joshi, and they loved it. Just make sure we're recording there. Yep, we are. So this is a story where there aren't any pictures, but you can lie back and listen and make your own pictures in your own mind. It's a really good way of maybe going to sleep. Okay, here we go. How Pat a Mouse Came to St Goran. In the village of Goran Churchtown, in the Duchy of Cornwall, there was a little white mouse called Pat a Mouse. He had 4 brothers, Peter Mouse, Pitter Mouse, Potter Mouse, and Putter Mouse, and they all lived together in a big wire cage in the bedroom of a boy called Jack. It was a nice enough cage, and Pat a Mouse and his brothers always had plenty to eat and drink. They had lots of clean wood shavings to sleep on, and on the whole they were very contented. But Pat a Mouse wanted to know what the world was like outside their cage. Sometimes when he was bored, he would sit and gnaw at the wire with his big, strong front teeth. His 4 brothers weren't in the least bit interested in what was outside. They spent all their time eating and sleeping, curled up together in a big contented ball. They just couldn't understand why Pat a Mouse was always so restless and curious. But as he sat and gnawed away at the wire, Pat a Mouse could hear all sorts of strange and interesting sounds. He longed to go and investigate. Sometimes a blackbird would sit on a branch outside the window and sing lovely songs about woods and fields and gardens. Pat a Mouse didn't know exactly what woods and fields and gardens were, but they did sound very nice. He wished he could go and see them for himself. Sometimes he would hear a very beautiful sound, a loud, clear ringing, ting-tang, ding-dang, bong-bo, over and over again. He heard this every Sunday morning and every Wednesday evening. Sometimes he heard it on Saturdays too. It was the sound of the 6 bells of St Goran's church, but Pat a Mouse did not know that. He had no idea what had made that sound, and he longed to know what it was. One Sunday morning, Pat a Mouse was sitting in a corner of the cage, gnawing away at the wire as usual, when suddenly, ping, the wire snapped, and there was a hole just big enough for a mouse to squeeze through. Goodness gracious me, thought Pat a Mouse. Now at long last I can get out of this cage and go and explore the big wide world. He sat back on his haunches and thought about that for a while. I must admit, he said to himself, that I am just a little bit afraid of the big wide world. So I think I shall wait until that lovely sound starts up again. Ting, tang, ding, dang, bong, bo. That will make me feel braver, I think. Then I shall squeeze out of the cage and start my exploring. At that very moment, the bells of St Goran's church began to ring, and the little boy Jack came rushing into the room and picked up the mouse cage. Pat a Mouse could hear Jack's mother shouting over the sound of the bells. "Hurry up now, Jack, we'll be late for the service." Pat a Mouse had no idea what that meant, and he had no time to think about it, for Jack rushed out of the room carrying the mouse cage. He hurried down the stairs and out of the front door. Pat a Mouse gasped in amazement. He had never been out of doors before, and everything was wonderful and strange. Even the air smelled different. It was cold and fresh and bright, and out here the lovely sound of the bells was even louder. "Look, look," he called to his 4 brothers. "We're outside, and it's all so exciting. Look, look, look." Peter Mouse twitched his long white whiskers and said, "Lots of fuss about nothing if you ask me." Then he went back to sleep again. Pitter Mouse opened one pink eye and said, "Wake me up when it's over." Then he went back to sleep again. Potter Mouse yawned and said, "Oh, don't bother waking me up until lunchtime." Then he went back to sleep again. Putter Mouse just grunted and turned over in his sleep and didn't wake up at all. Pat a Mouse gave up on his 4 brothers. He raced all around the cage, trying to see as much as possible of the wonderful world outside, and listening to the sound of the bells. Ting, tang, ding, dang, bong, bo. It was getting louder and louder. Up ahead he could see a big building of grey stone, with a tall tower at one end. This was the Church of St Goran, and it was where Jack and his mother were going. The vicar had decided to have a special church service for all the people of Goran Church Town and Goran Highlands and Goran Haven and their pets. As they got nearer to the church, Mouse saw lots of people, all carrying cages and boxes. There was even one with a jam jar full of water, with 2 goldfish swimming around in it. Mouse didn't know what goldfish were. In fact, he didn't really know much at all about other animals. But then he saw one animal that all mice are born knowing about. A cat. It was a big fat tabby cat being carried in by a little girl. It glared at Mouse, and there was a look in its bright yellow eyes that said, "I have sharp claws and lots of little sharp teeth, and I'd really, really like to know what a mouse tastes like." Mouse shivered and burrowed down under a pile of wood shavings. He was just a little bit worried now about the hole he had made in the wire, even though he knew it wasn't nearly big enough for a cat to get through. But it could reach in with one of those tabby paws with their sharp claws, he thought. He watched nervously as the little girl carried the cat into the Church of St Goran. Jack and his mother followed with the mouse cage. Jack sat down right next to the little girl. It was dark and cool inside the church after the brightness of the world outdoors. Mouse immediately felt at home. If it weren't for that cat, he thought, I should really like to get out of this cage and go exploring. Soon it was time for the service to begin. The church organ started to play. Mouse thought it made a lovely noise, even better than the blackbirds singing, and almost as good as the sound of the bells. I should like to live here, he thought, and I'd like to hear this beautiful music every day. He looked at the hole in the wire, but there was the big tabby cat in the very next seat. It was still watching him with a very nasty look in its bright yellow eyes. Then all the people stood up and started singing. All things bright and beautiful, all creatures great and small, all things wise and wonderful, the Lord God made them all. Mouse made a face at the cat and said, "You're so great and I'm so small, and I wished he'd never made you at all." The cat hissed at Mouse and said, "You wouldn't be so brave, little mousie, if you weren't shut up safe in that cage of yours." Mouse shivered. The cat was quite right, and even shut up safe inside his cage, he still didn't feel all that brave. The hymn went on for a few minutes, and then everyone stopped singing. They all knelt down and closed their eyes, and the vicar said a prayer about animals. Mouse kept his own eyes open and went on looking around the church. Suddenly he spotted a tiny movement out of the corner of his eye. He looked up, and there, looking down at him, was the most bright and beautiful creature he had ever seen in all his life. On a windowsill just above his head was a pot of pansies, and peeping out from amongst the pansy flowers was a little brown mouse with shining black eyes. She was the prettiest mouse that Mouse could ever have imagined. He never hesitated for a second. He forgot all about that cat, sitting just 2 seats away and staring at him with his fierce yellow eyes. Quick as a flash, he squeezed out through the hole he had gnawed in the wire and scrambled up the rough stone wall and onto the windowsill. "Hello," said Mouse. "Look out," squeaked the little brown mouse. There was a scrabbling of claws as the tabby cat leapt for the windowsill. As the cat jumped, the little girl opened her eyes. She tried to grab the cat, but she bumped into Jack and knocked the mouse cage onto the floor. Jack snatched up the cage, and the little girl managed to get hold of the cat. Everyone else in the church stopped praying and opened their eyes to glare at them. Then they all said, "Shh," and closed their eyes again. Jack looked anxiously into the mouse cage. All he could see was a contented huddle of white mice, and he never thought to count them. in spite of being dropped on the floor. Pattermouse's brothers were all still fast asleep. Meanwhile, up on the windowsill, Pattermouse and the little brown church mouse crouched down out of sight behind the pot of pansies. "My goodness, that was a near thing," said the little brown mouse. "I had no idea there was going to be a service this morning, let alone a service with all these animals. If I'd known, I would never have been caught out in the open like this. When all the people and all the animals started to come in, I was so frightened. The only place I could find to hide was this pot of flowers." "Well, I'm glad you were caught out," said Pattermouse. "Otherwise I would never have met you." The little brown mouse gave a shy smile. "Then I'm glad too," she said. "I wish I could stay here forever and ever," said Pattermouse. "Wouldn't you miss your nice cage and those other mice that I can see down there?" asked the little brown mouse. "Not really," said Pattermouse. "Those mice are my brothers, and I'm very fond of them, of course, but they're all a bit boring, to tell you the truth. They don't do much. In fact, all they really like doing is eating and sleeping." "You can stay here if you want to," said the little brown mouse. "There aren't very many of us church mice, and there's plenty of room for one more." "That would be wonderful," said Pattermouse happily. "I could listen to that lovely music, and I can hear that beautiful ringing sound so much better here too. The only thing I would miss is the blackbird who sings outside my window at home. I don't suppose he ever comes in here, does he?" "No," said the little brown mouse, "but you could still listen to his song, because he has a nest out in the churchyard. We often go out there on fine days. We have picnics and listen to him sing." "Then I really would like to stay," said Pattermouse, "if you're quite sure there's room for me. My name is Pattermouse, by the way." "Goodness gracious," said the little brown mouse, "my name is Mattermouse." "How extraordinary," said Pattermouse. "Well, that settles it. I'm sure we are meant to be together. Pattermouse and Mattermouse." "Oh yes," said Mattermouse, "I would like that very much." So when the service ended, the two mice watched as Jack and his mother left the church, carrying the mouse cage. The little girl followed them, carrying the tabby cat, which was hissing and spitting at Pattermouse and Mattermouse. Then all the other people and their pets went out into the warm sunshine. "Welcome to the Church of St Goran," said Mattermouse. "I hope you will be very happy here." "Oh, I know I shall be," said Pattermouse, and he was right. Pattermouse didn't have time to miss his brothers, even though he didn't see them again for a whole year. When the vicar held another animal service at the Church of St Goran, that's when he next saw them. He found that there were other mice to meet and a great many things to learn about his new life as a church mouse. All the other mice were very kind and friendly. There was a pretty little black mouse who had been born in the church on Christmas Day. She was called Chrissy Mouse. There was a brown mouse who had been born in the church on St Patrick's Day. He was called Shay Mouse. And he always tried to speak with an Irish accent. He also said Begoran a lot and called everyone me darlin'. The oldest mouse at St Goran was called Mousethuzela. He was very wise, and he had a grey coat and very long whiskers. He spent most of his time sleeping in his nest, which was behind one of the central heating pipes. The cleverest mouse at St Goran was a pale brown mouse he was born in the vicarage and used to belong to the vicar's son. He had once nibbled some pages of a magazine called The New Scientist and another one called National Geographic. So all the other mice knew that he must be a very clever mouse indeed. His name was Professor Quatermass. These days, Professor Quatermass had given up science and turned to religion. So now he mostly nibbled hymn books and sometimes copies of the parish magazine. Lastly, there was a little fat, sand-coloured mouse called Mustafa. He wasn't quite sure where he came from, but he knew that it was a very long way away from the Duchy of Cornwall. It was always very hot and dry in the country where he had been born, and the air smelled of spices and camels. Mustafa had tried to explain to the other mice what a camel was, but he had given up at the first hump. His story was a very strange and exciting one. I think it deserves a chapter of its own, so I shall tell you all about it another time. The church mice did their best to help Pat a Mouse to settle into his new home. They were all very proud of St Goran's. It was a lovely old church that stood in a pretty green churchyard in the village of Goran Church Town. The mice told Pat a Mouse that on fine days they would often go out into the churchyard to look for nuts and seeds and fruit to eat. The churchyard was a very peaceful place, but it could be a dangerous place too. Sometimes there were cats and stoats and weasels and owls and hawks, all on the lookout for a tasty mouse or two to take home for their tea. So the mice mostly stayed inside the church, where they knew they would be safe, and every day they would leave their nests and forage about for food. Pat a Mouse was very surprised to discover that the mice had to find their own food. "But doesn't someone come and feed you every day and change your water bowl and put down fresh wood shavings for you to sleep on?" he asked. All the church mice laughed when they heard this. "Oh, certainly not," said Chrissy Mouse. "We don't have anyone to look after us, but then we don't have anyone to lock us up in a cage either." On the whole, that sounded good to Pat a Mouse. "But what do you eat if there is no one to feed us?" he asked anxiously. "Oh, there is plenty of people to feed us," said Professor Quatermass, "but they don't know that that's what they're doing." Pat a Mouse was very puzzled by this. Madame Mouse explained to him that the people of the village always had a cup of coffee and a biscuit after their church services every Wednesday and Sunday, and so did the ladies who came every Friday to sweep the carpets and polish the brass altar rail and the big silver candlesticks. "So most days," said Madame Mouse, "we can find plenty of biscuit crumbs to eat. I love custard creams, but shortbread is the best of all. It is so soft that it makes lots and lots of crumbs." "The ladies of the church always sweep up the crumbs when they clear away the coffee cups," said Chrissy Mouse, "but they always miss a few. Sometimes we even find a sugar lump or two dropped on the floor." "We can't open the cupboard where they kept the biscuits and the sugar lumps," said Professor Quatermass, "but I am working on that problem, and I am expecting a breakthrough any day now. Then we shall be able to eat as many biscuits and as much sugar as we want, whenever we like." Madame Mouse shook her head. "I don't think that would be a very good idea," she said firmly. "If we did that, then the ladies who make the coffee would know that there are mice in the church, and they might not be very pleased." "Besides," said Chrissy Mouse, "it's all very well to keep the place neat, nice and tidy by eating up the crumbs and things that people have dropped on the floor. But I don't think we should take their biscuits and sugar out of their cupboard." "I quite agree," said Madame Mouse. "That would be stealing." She turned to Pat a Mouse. "I think we should only take things that people leave because they don't want them. Once some workmen came here to mend one of the heaters. After they'd gone, we found they had left a bit of cheese sandwich and an apple core, still with lots of good nibbling on it. That was a wonderful day." "Begoran, to be sure it was, me darlings," said Shay Mouse. "But to my mind the best time in all of the year is the harvest festival, so 'tis. The people decorate the whole church with fruits and vegetables, so they do, and we can be nibbling away at them all day long." "I think Christmas is even better," said Chrissy Mouse, "and not just because it's my birthday. The village people have mince pies instead of biscuits with their coffee. Mince pies always make lots of crumbs. But supposing there are no vegetables or fruit or cheese sandwiches or apple cores or sugar or crumbs," said Pat a Mouse anxiously. He was used to having his meals delivered regularly by Jack. The idea of having to forage for food instead of just helping himself from his food bowl was starting to worry him a bit. "Well, there are always candles to eat," said Madame Mouse. "Look, on the altar there, big fat white wax candles." "They don't taste very nice," said Chrissy Mouse. "That is very true," said wise old Methuselah. "But candles to eat are always better than no candles to eat. Never you fear, young fellow. It's been a very long time since we've had nothing to eat but candles. Not since I was a very young mouse indeed. In those days, people didn't have coffee and biscuits in the church, so times could be hard, very hard indeed, and we were always grateful for a nice fat candle to nibble and eat." "You'll be fine, don't you fret," said Professor Quatermass. You won't ever go hungry here. What you do need to worry about is that white fur coat of yours." "That's right," said Chrissy Mouse. "You'll have to be very careful not to be seen." We can hide quite easily in any dark corner, explained Madam Mouse, because we are grey, but with your lovely white coat you will really show up if anyone looks at you. Whatever can I do about it? Asked Madam Mouse anxiously. Someone is bound to see me if I don't hide away quickly enough. Don't worry too much, said Madam Mouse kindly. The doors of the church are very big and creaky, and the latch makes a big noise whenever anyone comes in, so you shouldn't be taken unawares. We'll show you all the best places to hide, said Chrissy Mouse, and you can practice remembering where they are and running to them as quickly as you can. But first we'll help you find a good place for your nest, said Madam Mouse. Thank you, said Madam Mouse. And will somebody come soon with some wood shavings to make my nest with? The church mice all laughed when they heard that. Certainly not, said Chrissy Mouse. We don't have anyone to bring us wood shavings. But that's all right, said Madam Mouse. Don't worry, you'll see. There are plenty of things in the church to make a cosy nest with. I expect you will find the cold at first, said Professor Catermouse. Since you have been living in a nice warm house, I came here from the vicarage, and I must say I used to feel the cold very much when I first arrived. I still feel the cold almost all the time, said Mustafa sadly. I come from a very warm country. There's a pile of old hassocks in the corner by the organ, said Madam Mouse. They're right next to the heating pipes, so they'll be nice and dry even when the heating isn't turned on. What's a hassock? asked Madam Mouse. It's a big, hard, square cushion, said Madam Mouse. People use them for kneeling on, and that means that they get worn out quite quickly. There are lots of old ones lying around that people don't use anymore. I'm sure we could find you one with a hole in it. Then you could pull out some of the stuffing to make room for a nest inside. Begoran, and a hassock is a very fine place for the making of a nest, to be sure it is, me darlings, said Shay Mouse. Shay Mouse's nest is in a hassock too, said Madam Mouse. It's a green one. All the mice went to look at the pile of old hassocks, and to help choose the best one for Madam Mouse to make him into a nest. In the end they decided on a dark red one which had a tear in its cover. With just a little bit of nibbling, the mice managed to make the hole big enough to squeeze through. Soon they were helping Madam Mouse to pull out lumps of stuffing to make some space inside. Mustafa worked especially hard, because now that the Sunday service was over, the heating had been turned off and he was already feeling cold. Working hard helped him to keep warm, but it still wasn't long before his little teeth were chattering. You know, said Madam Mouse, I think there may be a way for poor Mustafa to keep warm even when the heating has been turned off. How? Oh, please tell me how, cried Mustafa. Well, I'm not quite sure what it means, said Madam Mouse, but Jack, that's the boy I used to live with, his mother is always telling him to wrap up warm. If only we knew what that means, said Madam Mouse, who felt very sorry for poor Mustafa. Well, I'm not absolutely sure what it means, said Madam Mouse, but whenever Jack's mother says that, Jack always puts more clothes on. What are clothes? asked Chrissy Mouse. Surely you know that, said Madam Mouse. All the church mice shook their heads. Even clever Professor Catermouse and wise old Methuselah. Clothes are what people have to cover up their skins, instead of fur coats like ours, said Madam Mouse. Clothes come in all sorts of different shapes and colours, and people can take them off whenever they want. Take them off? Cried the church mice in astonishment. Yes, said Madam Mouse. He thought about it. I suppose you wouldn't know about that, because I expect you don't take clothes off in church. The church mice all shook their heads in amazement. We thought all those bright coverings that people have were stuck onto them, like fur or feathers or scales, said Professor Catermouse. I didn't know they could take them off. But how does that help poor Mustafa? Asked Madam Mouse. Well, said Madam Mouse, they can take them off and they can put them on. So if we could find some clothes, Mustafa could put them on, just like Jack's mother says. He could wrap up warm. I must say, that sounds like a very good idea, said Mustafa cautiously. If only we could find some clothes. There's a bit of white stuff over by the font, said Madam Mouse. One of the people who was here this morning dropped it. Would that be of any use? The mice all went to have a look. It was a small white handkerchief which had fallen out of someone's sleeve. Mustafa tried crawling underneath it. That did make him feel a little bit warmer, but as soon as he moved, it fell off again. "There must be a solution to this problem," said Professor Catamouse. "Leave it with me." He sat down by the handkerchief and thought about it. The other mice watched him hopefully, all holding their breath, for they knew that Professor Quatermass was a very clever mouse indeed. After a while, Professor Quatermass said, "I am expecting a breakthrough any day now." So the other mice stopped holding their breath and went back to helping Quatermass with his nest. It wasn't long before there was a nice cosy space inside the hassock, just big enough for a mouse nest. Quatermass thanked his new friends for their help. At that moment they heard the pitter-patter of a mouse approaching, and they all looked around to see the most extraordinary sight. There was Professor Quatermass' head coming towards them, but they could not see his body at all. As he got closer, they saw that his body was covered with the white handkerchief, and that the handkerchief didn't fall off when he moved. Professor Quatermass had had his breakthrough. He had chewed a hole just big enough to push his head through, and now he was wearing the handkerchief like a poncho. "Goodness me," said Mustafa, "that looks a bit like the clothes that people wear in the place where I was born. You know, the place with all the sand, spices and camels." "What's a camel?" asked Quatermass, but no one took any notice of him. They had all heard Mustafa trying to explain about camels, and it never made any sense. Professor Quatermass wriggled out of the handkerchief poncho and helped Mustafa to put it on. "There," said Quatermass, "now you are wrapped up warm." "Well, quite warm," said Mustafa, for it was only a very thin lace handkerchief. "Warmer," he added, seeing that everyone looked rather disappointed. "Much warmer than I was, thank you all very, very much." "That is very good," said Madame Mouse. "In future, let's all be on the lookout for other things that we could make into more clothes for Mustafa. I'm sure we'll find something if we look hard enough." And one day they did, but that's another story. As I told you in the last story, Mustafa was a little fat sand-coloured mouse. He had been born in a country called Egypt, which is very hot and dry and a very long way from the Duchy of Cornwall and the Church of St Goran. Mustafa was born in the house of a Cornishman who had worked all his life in Egypt. One day the old gentleman made up his mind to retire and return home to Cornwall to live. So he sold his house and packed up all his belongings. Amongst his belongings were 2 pet snakes that he could not bear to be parted from, so he made plans to take them to Cornwall with him. The journey would take several weeks, because the old gentleman hated flying, so he had decided to travel home by sea. He had a special travelling case made for his snakes, and sent one of his servants out to buy a large covered basket of plaited straw. On the night before he was due to leave, the old gentleman and his servants set lots of mouse traps all around the house and garden. By morning they had caught 10 mice, and one of them was Mustafa. They put all the mice into the big straw basket with some food and water. Then they fastened the lid down tight. Mustafa couldn't remember very much after that, except that it was very dark for a long time, days and days and days. Sometimes the basket was jolted around a lot, and sometimes it seemed to move gently up and down. The only thing that Mustafa did remember clearly was that every other day the basket was opened, a hand would reach in, and one mouse would be taken out of the basket, never to be seen again. None of the mice had any idea why this happened, and all of them, except Mustafa, were very eager to find out. So every time the hand reached in, the other mice would shove Mustafa out of the way. He didn't mind, he was rather a timid mouse, and he was not at all sure that he wanted to be chosen by the mysterious hand that reached into the basket. Eventually, after many days, Mustafa was the only mouse left. Luckily, by that time, he had managed to nibble a hole in the bottom of the basket. He squeezed through and ran off as fast as his little legs could carry him. When Mustafa stopped to look around, he discovered that he was in a big cold room which smelled of dogs and cats. He made his way along the walls until he found a door that he could creep underneath, that took him out into the open air, and he was just as amazed as Quatermass had been by the sights and smells of the world outdoors. Mustafa was in Goran Churchtown in the Duchy of Cornwall, and that is about as different as anywhere could possibly be from the hot, dry country where he had been born. Poor little Mustafa was both excited and frightened by his new surroundings. He was in the garden of the cottage that the old gentleman had bought to retire to. It was very different from the garden of the house in Egypt. Instead of being hot and dusty and dry, This garden was cool and damp and full of lush green plants that were all new and strange to Mustafa. He crept under a big green fern and crouched there with his paws over his eyes, trembling like a leaf and wondering what on earth to do next. When the bells of St. Goran suddenly started to ring, poor Mustafa nearly jumped out of his skin. But when he had calmed down and stopped quivering with fright, he decided that he liked the sound of the bells. So he made his way cautiously towards where he thought they must be. Eventually Mustafa arrived at St. Goran's church. All the church mice welcomed him kindly and soon made him feel safe, although he could never really feel at home there. "You are all so very kind," he would say, "and this is a very beautiful place, and it is so very nice and safe for a mouse, but oh dear, it is so cold." The other mice helped Mustafa to make a nest underneath one of the heaters, where sometimes it was warm enough even for him. But the heaters were only switched on when there was going to be a church service on Sundays and Wednesdays, and sometimes on Saturdays. So all of the rest of the time the poor little mouse shivered and quivered with the cold. Professor Quatermass promised Mustafa that he would try to discover how to make the heaters work all the time, and he always watched very carefully whenever the church wardens came into the church to switch them on. So far he had not worked out how it was done, but he told Mustafa that he was expecting a breakthrough any day. Mustafa never really quite understood what had happened to him, nor how lucky he was to have ended up safe in St. Goran's church. He had no idea that he had been caught and put in the covered basket in order to be food for the old gentleman's pet snakes on the long journey by sea to England. Just as well for Mustafa that the journey had not taken any longer, and that for most of the way the snakes felt seasick and weren't very hungry at all. As I've already told you, when Pattermouse came to live at St. Goran's, he explained to all of the mice all about clothes and how they might help to keep Mustafa warm whenever the heaters were turned off. The first attempt at making clothes was very successful. Mustafa was very proud of his robe made out of the small white handkerchief by clever Professor Quatermass, but winter was coming and every day it was getting colder and colder in the church. Although Mustafa never complained, the other mice noticed that he was shivering almost all of the time now. Some days he was too cold even to leave his nest. One Sunday after morning service, all the mice except Chrissy Mouse were foraging for crumbs under the table where the ladies of the church had just served coffee and biscuits. Chrissy Mouse was searching instead among the seats where some children had been sitting. She knew that children often bring sweets to eat in church, and there was always a chance that they might have dropped some. So Chrissy Mouse was pottering happily about, nose a-twitch for the smell of chocolate, when suddenly she saw a monster. She gave a squeak of terror and bolted for her nest. "Good gracious," said Madam Mouse, "whatever is the matter with Chrissy Mouse? She sounded very frightened." "Perhaps we'd better go and find out," said wise old Methuselah. All the mice trotted over to Chrissy Mouse's nest. "Chrissy Mouse, what's the matter?" called Madam Mouse, peering into the nest where Chrissy Mouse was curled up in a ball and quivering with fright. "It's a monster, she wailed. "What sort of a monster?" asked Professor Quatermass. "It was bright red and it had 5 legs, squeaked Chrissy Mouse. The others all looked at each other in astonishment. "Do you think it saw you?" asked Madam Mouse nervously, looking over her shoulder. "No," said Chrissy Mouse, it couldn't have seen me. It hasn't got a head," and she buried her nose in her paws and shut her eyes tight. The other mice thought about this for a while. "Well," said Professor Quatermass sensibly, "if it hasn't got a head, then it must be dead, so it can't do us any harm." "That's true," said Madam Mouse. "Ah, to be sure, 'tis very true," said Seamus. "Are you quite certain?" said Mustafa. "The only way to find out is for someone to go and have a look," said wise old Methuselah. "I'll go," said Pattermouse, who had always been very curious. He had never seen a monster before, dead or alive. He was a little bit frightened, but he was also very keen to see whatever it was that had made Chrissy Mouse run away and hide. "I shall come with you," said Madam Mouse bravely, and the two of them set off for the place where Chrissy Mouse had seen the monster. And there it was. Chrissy Mouse was right. It was bright red and it had 5 legs and no head. It was actually a little red woolen fingerless glove which had been dropped there by one of the children who had been at the service that morning. Pattermouse and Mattermouse looked at it for a long time, waiting to see if it moved. "I'm sure it's dead," said Pattermouse after a while. He crept nearer to have a better look. "Oh, do be careful," said Mattermouse anxiously. "It might only be asleep." Pattermouse looked closely at the glove. "I don't think it's ever been alive," he said. "Do you know, I think it might be a sort of clothes." "Clothes?" said Mattermouse. "Could it be useful for Mustafa?" "Let's fetch Professor Quatermass and see what he thinks," replied Pattermouse. "It certainly looks as if it would be warmer than that white robe he made." Professor Quatermass spent a long time looking at the little red glove and looking at Mustafa and looking at the glove again. Finally he said, "I think I have made a breakthrough," and all of the mice cheered. "Now, Mustafa, I need you to follow my instructions very carefully," went on Professor Quatermass. "First of all, see where this big opening is. Mattermouse and I will hold it open, and then I want you to turn around and back into it." Mattermouse and Professor Quatermass held the wrist opening so that Mustafa could back slowly into the glove. There was elastic around the wrist opening, which stretched as Mustafa backed in. Then it tightened up again to fit snugly around his neck. "Well done," said Professor Quatermass. "Now poke your tail out through here." He reached into the middle finger of the glove, caught hold of Mustafa's tail, and pulled it through. "Good," said Professor Quatermass. "Now push your front feet through this hole and this hole." And Mustafa pushed his left front paw through the thumb of the glove and his right front paw through the little finger of the glove. "Excellent," said Professor Quatermass. "Now push your back feet through this hole and this hole." And Mustafa pushed his left back paw through the first finger of the glove and his right back paw through the third finger of the glove. "Perfect," said Professor Quatermass. And so it was. Mustafa couldn't believe how cosy and warm he felt, all snug inside the little red woolly glove. "I have never felt so warm since I left my old home," he said, with tears of happiness in his eyes. "Thank you, Professor Quatermass, and thank you, Christy Mouse, for finding these lovely clothes. Now I shall never ever be cold again." And he never ever was. Now, Pattermouse soon settled down very happily in St Goran's church. He particularly enjoyed listening to the sound of the bells going ting, tang, ding, dang, bong, bo. They rang every Sunday for the morning service and every Wednesday evening at bell ringing practice. Pattermouse would always stop whenever he was he would always stop whatever he was doing to listen. None of the other mice knew much about how the sound was made. "All we really know," said Chrissy Mouse, "is that it is something called the bells, and that they are kept in the belfry, which is at the top of the bell tower," added Mattermouse. "The bell tower is behind those big wooden doors at the west end of the church," said Professor Quatermass. "If you look up, you will see that there are windows above the doors." Pattermouse craned his neck to look up. Sure enough, above the doors there were big windows, like a wall of glass. Through the windows he could see 6 ropes hanging down. "Goodness gracious me," explained Pattermouse. "What on earth are those? They look like tails. They must be the tails of some very, very big animals." No, said Professor Quatermass, "they aren't the tails of very big animals. Those are called the bell ropes. There are 6 bells and each one is tied to a rope." "Why?" asked Pattermouse. "I suspect," said Professor Quatermass cautiously, "that it may be to stop them escaping." "Goodness me," said Pattermouse, "I can see that there is a lot I don't know about bells. I would like to know much, much more, and I would really, really love to see one." The other mice all looked very doubtful about this. "We have been told that the bells can be very, very dangerous," said Professor Quatermass. "I expect that is why they are kept tied up with ropes." "Have you ever seen them?" asked Pattermouse. "No," replied Professor Quatermass. "We have been told that they live at the top of the bell tower and that they are very difficult to get to see." "I've never seen them," said Chrissy Mouse. "Neither have I," said Mattermouse. "I don't think any of us has, except Mousimoto, of course." "Who is Mousimoto?" asked Pattermouse. Oh, he is a mouse who lives by himself in the bell tower, said Professor Quatermass. It was Masimoto who told us everything we know about the bells. Why does he live by himself? Asked Pattermouse. He had never been alone in his life. First he had lived with his brothers, and now he lived with the Mice of St Goran. The idea of being alone made him feel rather sad and a little bit frightened. Masimoto says he likes to be on his own, said Madame Mouse. He sometimes comes and visits us all at Christmas and Harvest Festival, and on Masimoto Sunday, of course, but that's the first Sunday after Easter, you know. But mostly he says he would rather be by himself. He doesn't like other mice very much, said Professor Quatermass. He is what is called a misogynist. But he is very proud of his bells, and he loves to talk about them, said Chrissy Mouse. He offered to show me the bells once, but I was too frightened. He said they could be dangerous, and that it was very difficult to get to see them. Oh, I should like to see them, said Pattermouse. Do you think Masimoto would show me? Oh, I'm sure he would, said Mattermouse, and I don't know, he would enjoy taking someone who was interested in his bells, I guess. I shall take you to meet him, said Professor Quatermass. Then I shall be able to hear if he has anything new to tell us about the bells. That is what we scientists call research. Come with me. Wait, said Madame Mouse. Take this nice big biscuit for Crumb for Masimoto. I'm sure he doesn't eat enough in that bell tower. Madame Mouse fetched a crumb of shortbread and gave it to Pattermouse. Then Professor Quatermass led him to the foot of the big wooden doors to the bell tower. Over this way, said Professor Quatermass. There's a big gap here, where the wood has rotted away with the damp. It's quite a squeeze, said fat little Mustafa. I can hardly get through. Not that I really want to. I don't like the thought of those bells, not one little bit. And anyway, it's very cold in there. You can feel the draught from out here. Professor Quatermass squeezed under the door. Pattermouse pushed the shortbread crumb through the gap and then squeezed through himself. As Mustafa had said, the bell tower was much colder than the church. The bottom part of the bell tower was called the ringing chamber. This was a big square room with a ceiling so high above their heads that Pattermouse could hardly see it. Each of the bell ropes hung down through a hole in the ceiling. A few feet off the ground, a short length of each rope was covered in a soft red material, like a long fluffy sausage. Whatever is that for? Asked Pattermouse. You'll have to ask Masimoto about that, said Professor Quatermass. I understand it is called the Sally, or some such name, but I'm afraid I've never really understood much about the bells. I'm a scientist, you see, not a musician. Now wait a minute while I give him a call. Professor Quatermass sat up on his haunches and called out, Masimoto! 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 After a moment or two, one of the bell ropes began to quiver, and from high up in the air a tiny squeaky voice could just be heard. The bells! The bells! The bells! That's him, said Professor Quatermass. He'll be down in a minute, I expect. The rope began to swing very gently, and Pattermouse heard a faint ringing sound. Ting, ting, ting. Professor Quatermass looked at Pattermouse and his nose twitched. I suppose I ought to warn you, he said, that Masimoto is a little bit, well, mad. He once told me that there are mice up in the belfry that can fly. Well, I ask you, flying mice. Professor Quatermass shook his head. Anyway, we all call him Little Mad Mousimoto. Little Mad Mousimoto. His nose twitched again. Well, all of us except Mattermouse. She calls him poor little Mousimoto, and she is always worrying about him. She thinks he doesn't get enough to eat. The rope quivered again. Suddenly, Pattermouse could see a tiny grey mouse scampering down head first, still squeaking, The bells! The bells! The bells! When the mouse reached the fluffy red Sally, it stopped and peered down at the two visitors. The bells! It said again. That's right, old chap, said Professor Quatermass. Now, I've brought along a young friend of mine who would like to know all about your bells. The bells! Squeaked Little Grey Mouse. His name is Pattermouse, Professor Quatermass continued. Now come along down, there's a good fellow, and tell him what he wants to know. He turned to Pattermouse. Actually, if you don't mind, I think I'll just leave you to it. He sounds even madder than usual today, so I don't suppose I should learn anything useful if I did stay. Anyway, it's a bit chilly in here for me. And with that, he squeezed back through the gap under the door. Pattermouse looked up at the little grey mouse. The bells, he said rather nervously. The bells! squeaked the little grey mouse happily, and scampered down the rope to the ground. I really would like to know all about them, said Mouse. They make such a lovely sound. Oh, and Mouse sent you this biscuit crumb, by the way. Moto sniffed at the crumb of shortbread and nibbled a tiny bit of it. That is delicious. I shall save the rest for later, he said to Mouse. Tell Mouse she is so kind. Whenever I see her, she always asks me if I am sure I'm getting enough to eat. Now, the bells. With that, he scurried up the rope again. He stopped when he reached the Sally and peered down at Mouse. That is the rope, he said. This red bit is the Sally. The Sally is nice and soft, so the bell ringers don't hurt their hands when they ring the bells. Mouse climbed carefully up the rope. All mice are good at climbing, and the rope was quite rough, so his little sharp claws could get a good grip. What are the bell ringers? He asked. They are people who come here to the ringing chamber and pull on the ropes. That's what makes the bells ring, said Moto. And he ran 3 times around the Sally, squeaking, the bells, the bells, the bells. The other mice told me that the bells are dangerous, said Mouse. Is that true? Yes, they are. No, they aren't, said Moto. Most of the times the bells are perfectly safe, but when they are ringing, oh, then they are very, very dangerous. He ran around the Sally again, then straight down the rope to the floor, where he sat back on his haunches and started to clean his whiskers. Mouse followed him down very carefully. Climbing head first down a rope is quite difficult, even for a mouse. You must never go into the belfry when the bells are ringing, said Moto. Never, never, never. The belfry is up at the very top of the bell tower. It is where the bells are kept. If you were there when the bells began to ring, the noise would be too much to bear. He gave a little squeak and covered his ears with his paws. And when the bells are ringing, they swing backwards and forwards. You would be knocked right off your paws or squashed flat. I should still like to see the bells, said Mouse, if only I could be sure that they would not ring while I was there. I will take you if you like, said Moto, but it's a long, hard climb, and it's much too late to go today. The bell ringers will soon be here for their practice. You will have to come back another day. He scampered back up the Sally again and ran around it 3 times. Goodbye, he squeaked. The bells, the bells, the bells. And with that, he scuttled straight up the rope to the hole in the ceiling. Goodbye, called Mouse as Moto's tail whisked out of sight. Thank you. I shall come back soon. All he heard in reply was a very faint ringing. Ding, ding, ding. And Moto's little squeaky voice getting further and further away. The bells, the bells, the bells. After his visit to Moto, Mouse squeezed back through the gap under the door of the bell tower. He found that all the mice were waiting on the other side to hear how he had got on. How is Moto? Asked Mouse. How did he look? Do you think he's taking proper care of himself and getting enough to eat? Oh, I don't know about that, said Mouse, but I'm sure he's happy, although he does seem a little bit mad. I think that is because he lives alone and doesn't get out much, said Professor Mouse. Why does he live alone? Asked Mouse. Doesn't he have a family? Moto is one of the gypsy mice, said wise old Methuselah. They spend all their lives wandering in the world outside, always moving from place to place. I am the only one left here now who can remember when Moto came to St Goran's. It was a very cold winter that year, and a little band of gypsy mice came to the church to take shelter from a bitter storm. Moto was only a tiny baby then, but when he heard the sound of the bells he loved it so much that he decided he would never leave. His family stayed here all through the winter until the snow melted and the spring came. Then they all went back to their wandering life and he stayed on without them. And that is why he is here all alone. So he is just like me, said Mouse. I decided to stay here because I love the sound of the bells and my family all went away. And I hope you are happy here too, just like Moto, said Mouse shyly. Oh yes, said Mouse. Everyone has made me feel so welcome, especially you. Mouse stopped and wrinkled his nose nervously. I wonder if you would like to come with me when I go to see the bells. Oh, that would be much too frightened. I would be much too frightened to do that, squeaked Chrissy Mouse. Oh, I wouldn't, said Mouse. I would be frightened, Mouse, but not if I was with you. "Shall we go tomorrow then?" asked Pat Mouse happily. "Oh yes," replied Mouse, "I would like that very much." Shay Mouse shook his head. "Sure me Goran, me darlings," he said, "I'm thinking the both of you is as mad as little mad Mousey Modo, so I am." "You just leave them alone," said wise old Methuselah. He had lived for more years than he could remember, and he had seen a lot of mouse romances in his time. "I'm sure they will enjoy going on an adventure together." "It is called having some quality time," said Professor Quatermass. Early next morning, Pattermouse and Mattermouse met at the door to the bell tower. Mattermouse had bought another nice biscuit crumb for Mousey Modo, and together they pushed it through the gap under the door. Then they squeezed themselves into the ringing chamber. "Mousey Modo," called Mattermouse, "are you there? Are you there, dear?" After a moment or two, one of the bell ropes began to quiver, and from high up in the air a tiny squeaky voice could be heard. "The bells, the bells, the bells!" "Mousey Modo," called Pattermouse, "do come down. Mattermouse has come to see you." The rope began to swing very gently, and there was a faint, soft sound. Ting, ting, ting. "Mousey Modo," called Mattermouse, "I've bought you another crumb. I'm sure you're not looking after yourself properly. When you have eaten it, Pattermouse and I would love to visit your bells." The rope quivered again. Suddenly Mousey Modo came scampering down head first, still squeaking, "The bells, the bells, the bells!" When he reached the fluffy red Sally, he stopped and peered at the two visitors. "The bells," he said again. "That's right," said Pattermouse. "Can we come and see them now?" Mousey Modo ran down to the floor. "Welcome to the bell tower, Mattermouse," he said. He looked at the biscuit crumb. "Another feast. You are very kind, Mattermouse." "You are very welcome, dear," said Mattermouse. "Now you eat it all up, and then we'll go and have a look at your bells." "The bells, the bells, the bells," said Mousey Modo. He nibbled away at the biscuit crumb until it was all gone. "The bells," he said again. "This way to the bells," and he scampered up the rope again. Mattermouse and Pattermouse followed him. At the Sally they stopped for a little rest and looked up. The tip of Mousey Modo's tail whisked through the hole in the ceiling and out of sight. "This way," they heard him squeaking. "To the bells, to the bells, to the bells." Pattermouse and Mattermouse climbed on upwards. It was quite hard work and a long way for little mice to go. The rope swung backwards and forwards too, which made it difficult to hold on. "Oh," squeaked Mattermouse, "I do wish the rope would stay still. If you were not here I should be so frightened." "Don't be afraid," said Pattermouse bravely. "I won't let you fall off." "And I won't let you fall off," said Mattermouse. Soon they reached the hole in the ceiling. They climbed through and found that they were in a big dusty room with a ceiling just as high as the ringing chamber down below. Once again the ropes went on upwards to disappear through more holes in the ceiling. "Oh, it looks such a long way," said Mattermouse. "I do hope that when we get through that ceiling that we shall be there." "Mousey Modo," Pattermouse called out, "are we nearly there yet?" But the only reply was a faint ting, ting, ting from high above their heads. "Oh well, onwards and upwards," said Mattermouse bravely. "I am so glad you are with me." "So am I," said Pattermouse. "I'm sure it's not far now." After another long climb, the two mice reached the ceiling and scrambled through the hole. "Welcome," squeaked Mousey Modo. "Welcome to the belfry." Pattermouse and Mattermouse saw that Mousey Modo was not clinging to the rope any more. He was sitting on the dusty floor next to the hole in the ceiling. They both jumped off the rope and sat down beside him. "Now," said Mousey Modo in a voice of great excitement, "the bells." He pointed, and the two mice turned to look, and there were the 6 bells of St Goran, the little treble who sings out ting, the second bell who answers tang, and the third who cries ding, and the fourth who answers dang, and then the 5th big bell who shouts out bong, and the last of all the mighty tenor whose voice goes bow like thunder in the sky. For a little while all 3 mice gazed at the huge bells. Each one was attached to a big wheel, and the bell ropes ran up and around the rims of the wheels. Mousey Modo jumped back onto a bell rope and scuttled it up. Then he leapt from the rope onto the top of one of the bells. His little feet made it go ting as he landed. "This is the smallest bell," said Mousey-Moto. "It is called the treble. And that one over there, that is the biggest bell. It is called the tenor." He scuttled across to the tenor bell. "This is my favourite bell," he said. And then suddenly he stopped and stood quivering with fright. Slowly, 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 the great tenor bell was beginning to move. It was starting to swing very gently backwards and forwards. Mousey-Moto gave a squeak of fear. "The bells, the bells, the bells," he squealed. "Someone is raising the bells. Run, run, run for your lives." And with that he scampered head first down the rope and disappeared through the hole in the ceiling. Pattermouse watched as the tenor bell went on swinging, and then suddenly all the other bells started to move as well. "We must get out of the belfry, Madam Mouse," he shouted. "Quick, jump onto one of the ropes." "But the ropes are all going up and down," cried Madam Mouse, and they were. As the bells began to swing backwards and forwards, the ropes also began to go up and down. "We must jump and catch hold of a rope so we can climb down it," said Pattermouse. "We must get out of the belfry before the bells start to ring." At that moment Mousey-Moto appeared again. He rose up through the hole in the floor, clinging onto a rope. Then he dropped back down out of sight as the rope carried him down again. "Jump!" he squeaked. "Jump onto a rope! You must get out of the belfry!" And he rose up and dropped back down again out of sight. "Now!" shouted Pattermouse. Mattermouse jumped and caught hold of one of the ropes as it rose up. She clung on as tight as it dropped down. Pattermouse jumped too, and just as he did so, all the bells of St Goran began to speak. Ting, tang, ding, dang, bong, bo. Poor Pattermouse could not believe how loud they were. Every time his rope rose up into the belfry, he thought he would be deafened. Even when the rope went down through the floor again, he could hardly hear himself think. Dazed and deafened, the poor little mouse somehow managed to inch down the rope. At last he reached Mattermouse, who was clinging on for dear life. Then together they slid down the rope as it went on rising and falling until they reached the floor of the room below the belfry. Mousey-Moto was there already. He had jumped off his rope, and now he crouched with his paws over his ears. Pattermouse and Mattermouse jumped off too and sat down beside him, quivering with the noise of the bells. "We can't go down yet," said Mousey-Moto unhappily. "If we go down into the ringing chamber, the bell ringers will see us. We have to stay here until the bells stop." "How long will that be?" shouted Pattermouse over the din. "I don't know," wailed Mousey-Moto. "I don't know why the bell ringers are here. It was practice night last night. They shouldn't be here today." "Perhaps there's going to be a special service," shouted Mattermouse, trying hard to make herself heard. Suddenly, down in the ringing chamber, a man's voice shouted, "Set next time." There was one more round of ting, tang, ding, dang, bong, bo, and then silence. "Thank goodness for that," said Pattermouse. "Have they finished, do you think?" asked Mattermouse, "or have they only just stopped for a rest?" "I think they've finished for now," said Mousey-Moto cautiously. "I think they are only here to raise the bells, not to ring them." "What does that mean?" asked Pattermouse. "To raise the bells. What does that mean?" "It means that they have got the bells ready to be rung later. If we go back up into the belfry, you will see that instead of hanging downwards, all the bells are facing upwards now." "I don't really think I want to go and see that," said Pattermouse. "No," said Mattermouse, "neither do I." "Well, it is very dangerous to be in the belfry once the bells have been raised," said Mousey-Moto. "The smallest thing can make them topple over and start to ring on their own." "The smallest thing?" said Pattermouse. "Even a mouse?" "Oh, I expect so," said Mousey-Moto. "Do you want to try it and see?" "No," squeaked Pattermouse. "It has all been very interesting and very exciting, but now I really would like to go home, and I'm sure Mattermouse would like to go home too." "Yes, please," said Mattermouse. "I am glad I have seen your bells, Mousey-Moto, but I really don't want to hear them any more." "We shall have to wait until the bell ringers have gone," said Mousey-Moto. He crept over to one of the holes in the floor and peeped down through it. "Yes," he said, "I was right. They aren't going to ring now. They have tied up the ropes. That means they only came to raise the bells so that they can be ringing later. He looked again. They're leaving now, so we could go down. Patamouse reached for a bell rope to climb down. No! Squeaked Masimoto. He looked horrified. I told you. You mustn't touch the ropes now. The bells are balanced, and the smallest thing will make them topple over and start to ring on their own. So how can we get down to the ringing chamber? Asked Matamouse anxiously. I really would like to go home now, dear. This way, said Masimoto. We will have to use the staircase. He led the way across the dusty floor to the door of the room and out onto a spiral staircase. A spiral staircase is like an ordinary staircase, except that the stairs go round and round and round. It is quite difficult for a person to climb up and down. It is very difficult for a mouse. The steps were all made of stone, which was smooth and slippery, and each of the steps was very high. Masimoto seemed to be quite used to them. He jumped down easily, but Patamouse and Matamouse had a real scramble. Their paws hurt, and they kept losing their footing and tumbling down onto the hard stone steps. It seemed to take them forever to get down to the bottom. At last they reached the little wooden door. Masimoto showed them where they could squeeze underneath it, and then they were all back again in the ringing chamber. They saw that the bell ropes were not hanging down to the floor anymore. They were all tied up just below their sallies. That is to warn people that the bells are raised, said Masimoto. When the ropes are tied up like that, it tells people to be very careful. Patamouse and Matamouse jumped down one last big step and onto the floor of the ringing chamber. Goodness me, said Matamouse, what an adventure! I am so glad it is over. You were very brave, said Patamouse. So were you, said Matamouse. And now home. Goodbye, squeaked Masimoto. I am so glad you enjoyed it. Come again any time. And he squeezed back under the door to the spiral staircase. They could hear his voice getting fainter and fainter. The bells, the bells, the bells. The other mice were all waiting outside the doors to the bell tower. They looked very worried. Quickly, quickly, said Professor Quatermass. We must all get out of the church as quickly as possible. Why? Asked Patamouse. Can't you smell it? Squeaked Chrissy Mouse, her voice trembling with fright. Can't you smell the smoke? Patamouse and Matamouse sniffed the air. Sure enough, there was the smell of smoke. Something is burning behind the cupboard where they keep the coffee and the biscuits, said Professor Quatermass. There are some hot wires there. I think one of them has got too hot. It has set fire to the back of the cupboard. We must all get out. We were only waiting for you to warn you to get out as well. Well, what about Masimoto? Asked Matamouse anxiously. Isn't he here with you? Asked old Methuselah. He went back up to the bells, said Matamouse. I'll go and call him. And she slipped back into the bell tower. Will the whole church burn down? Asked Chrissy Mouse in a quavering voice. Oh, I'm afraid it may, said old Methuselah sadly. There must be something we can do, said Patamouse. How can we stop a fire? Asked Methuselah. Only people can do that. By the time people know about the fire, it may be too late, said Professor Quatermass. So we must tell them now, said Patamouse. We must call for help. There are no people near enough to hear us, said Professor Quatermass. No, said Patamouse, but they would hear the bells. The other mice looked at him in surprise. There is no time to explain, said Patamouse. You must all follow me. And with that he squeezed back under the door and into the ringing chamber. Matamouse had called Masimoto by now, and the little grey mouse had just come back down the spiral staircase. What is it? He asked. He was sitting up on his haunches and his nose was twitching. What's wrong? I can smell burning. That's right, said Patamouse. There is a fire in the church. We must call people to come and put it out. You told us that the smallest thing would set the bells ringing, even a mouse. Well, here are 8 mice. Tell us how to ring a bell. Masimoto looked at them and looked at the bell ropes. Very well, he said, pointing to one of the ropes. It was tied up nearly 2 feet off the floor. That is the rope for the smallest bell, the treble. We must all jump up and catch that rope. I am sure that will be enough to make the bell start ringing. I don't think I can jump that high, said Chrissy Mouse. Yes, you can, said Patamouse sternly. We all can. We must. Of course we can do it, said Methuselah. Now, everyone is to jump up and catch hold of the rope when Masimoto says. You must jump onto the rope when I say now, said Masimoto, and you must all jump off again as soon as they say off. This is very important. Otherwise, you will all go shooting up in the air when the bell starts to ring. The end of the rope will wave about all over the place when the bell starts. You would never be able to hold on, and you would fall off when you were high up in the air. All the mice looked very nervous at this, but they were brave little souls, and they were determined to save the church from the fire. Very well, said Mousey Modo. Now, all 8 mice sprang into the air and grabbed hold of the rope. For a moment nothing happened. Then suddenly the rope dropped down. Off, Mousey Modo, and they all let go just in time. The rope shot up into the air again. The tail end of it disappeared through the hole in the ceiling. Run, shouted Mousey Modo. Quick, quick, get under the bench. The mice all scuttered under the bench that stood along one wall of the ringing chamber. Ting, went the treble bell. The rope came flying down again. It seemed waving about. Ting, went the treble bell again, and the rope shot up in the air. Ting, ting, ting. Then the mice heard a commotion outside, and the bell ringers came rushing back into the ringing chamber. The treble's gone, said one of them. However could that have happened? Watch out for that rope. Never mind that, said another. I can smell smoke. There's a fire in the church, said a third. They opened the door into the church, and lots of thick black smoke poured into the ringing chamber. Everyone started coughing, mice and men. One of the bell ringers picked up the fire bucket that stood in the ringing chamber and took it to the fire. The bucket was full of sand, and he tipped it all over the fire. The mice were very puzzled by this, but sand is a very good thing for putting out fires. The other bell ringers ran to fetch water. In a little room behind the organ there was a sink that the church ladies used for arranging flowers. On the draining board stood lots of vases of all shapes and sizes, from little jam jars to great big urns. The bell ringers filled all the vases with water and took them to pour over the flames. At last the thick black smoke stopped. Instead there was lots of white steam from the water that had been poured on the fire. Thank goodness, said one of the bell ringers. The fire is safely out now. What a lucky thing the bell started ringing like that, said another. If we hadn't heard the bell, we would never have come back in time to stop that fire. Let's all have a nice cup of tea and a biscuit, said another. Later that evening, when the church was empty again, the Mice of St Goran crept out of hiding. The fire was out, that was good. But even better were all the crumbs that the bell ringers had left behind. And even better than that, the fire had made a hole in the back of the cupboard, so now the mice could get to the biscuits and the sugar instead of just picking up crumbs. I still don't think it's right to take things from the cupboard, said Mattermouse, but perhaps we deserve it just this once. Certainly we do, said wise old Methuselah. If it wasn't for us, the whole church could have burnt down. Just this once I think we deserve to eat a whole packet of biscuits, don't you? So they did. I expect you remember that Pattermouse had once belonged to the little boy called Jack. After the pet service at St Goran's, when Pattermouse escaped into the church, it was a long time before Jack realised that he had only 4 mice, not 5. Jack's mother was very cross about it. She was very frightened of mice, and it had taken Jack a long time to persuade her to let him have some. And now one of the nasty little things has got loose in your bedroom, said Jack's mother. I shall go and buy a mousetrap immediately, and you will pay for it out of your pocket money. So Jack's mother went straight off to the hardware store and bought a mousetrap. A mousetrap is a little box with a door at one end. You have to lift up the door, prop it open, and put a piece of cheese inside. As soon as a mouse smells the cheese, it will run into the box. The door falls shut, snap, and the mouse is trapped inside the box. When Jack's mother got home, she put a little bit of cheese in the mousetrap. Jack, Jack, she called out, you come down here right now and see what I've got, and make sure you shut your bedroom door behind you. Jack came downstairs to look. Here's a mousetrap, said Jack's mother. Put it up in your room and the mouse will soon be caught. It costs £5, so I'm going to take £5 and 2 pence out of your pocket money this month. That will teach you to take more care of your mice in the future. Why 2 pence? Asked Jack. That is for the piece of cheese, said Jack's mother. Jack put the mousetrap under his bed. He waited and waited and waited. Of course nothing happened, except that the cheese got smellier and smellier. Jack's mother would not go into his room anymore, so she did not smell the cheese for a very long time. In the end, the cheese got so bad that the smell of it crept out of Jack's bedroom and all over the house. Jack's mother took 2 more pence out of his pocket money for the new piece of cheese. Another week went by, and another, and another. The original cheese was replaced many times over, but the mousetrap went on and on. It was the longest running mousetrap ever. Poor Jack had to pay for all of the cheese out of his pocket money, and still there was no sign of Pat a Mouse. "It's no good," said Jack's mother. "I don't believe that wretched mouse is in your room at all. It must be somewhere in the rest of the house. You'll have to put the mousetrap outside your bedroom." So the mousetrap went on tour, first on the landing, then in the living room, then in the kitchen. Still there was no sign of the missing mouse. Of course, we all know that was because Pat a Mouse had not escaped in Jack's house at all. We know that he had escaped in St Goran's church, and he was still there, living happily with the church mice. After 2 whole months, Jack had a brainwave. "Mum," he said excitedly, "I don't think the mouse is in the house at all. I bet I lost him in the church on the day of the pet service." Jack's mother thought about this. "I suppose that's possible," she said. "I shall ask the vicar if he will let you put your mousetrap in the church. It will be very nice not to have that smelly old cheese in the house any more." So Jack's mother spoke to the vicar, and he agreed that Jack could put his mousetrap in the church. "Not where anyone can see it, mind," he said. "I don't want people thinking we have mice in the church. Put it underneath one of the pews at the very back, where no one ever sits. But mind you, take out that nasty smelly bit of cheese. You will have to find something else to put in the trap, otherwise people will think I have left a pair of smelly old socks lying around in the church." Jack looked up mouse food on the internet and found that mice eat all sorts of things as well as cheese. They eat seeds and insects and fruit and nuts. Jack bought a little bag of peanuts from the village shop to use instead of cheese. He put a peanut into the mousetrap, propped open the door, and crept out of the church. It wasn't long before the mice smelled the peanut. You probably think that peanuts don't really smell of anything, but if you are hungry, they do. They smell of dinner. All the mice crowded around the mousetrap. None of them could remember seeing anything like it before. They were very curious and just a little bit frightened of it. "What is it, Professor Quatermass?" said Chrissy Mouse. The cleverest mouse at St Goran shook his head. "Do you know what it is, Mouseoothala?" asked Matamouse. The oldest and wisest mouse at St Goran shook his head. They all looked at the mousetrap again. The peanut smelled very good, and they were longing to find out if it tasted good too. Suddenly Mustafa gave a great squeak. "I'm sure I've seen something like this before," he cried. "Where? When? What is it?" asked all the other mice. I can't remember," said Mustafa. "I think it was in the country where I was born. You know, the place with all the sand and spices and camels." "What's a camel?" asked Mouse, and everyone else goes, "Shh!" They had heard all about camels from Mustafa lots of times, and it never made much sense. "I don't know what that thing is," said Mustafa. "I think I might remember it if I keep trying." "Perhaps if you tasted that whatever it is in there that smells so good," suggested Professor Quatermass, "that might jog your memory." "That's a good idea," said Mustafa, and he scurried into the mousetrap. Snap! The door shut, and Mustafa was caught. The other mice immediately saw that he couldn't get out. Mustafa ate the peanut. Then he saw that he couldn't get out. "I can't get out," he said sadly, "and now I remember. I knew I had seen one of these things before. It's a mousetrap." "Of course," said Professor Quatermass. "You told us you were caught in one and put into a big wicker basket." "Yes," said Mustafa, "and then I was brought here, and I never saw my home again." Chrissy Mouse and Matamouse started to cry. "Someone will come and put Mustafa in a big wicker basket," wept Matamouse. "We will never see him again," sobbed Chrissy Mouse. There," said Professor Quatermass. "There must be something we can do. Just leave it with me." He stared at the mousetrap and at poor little Mustafa, who was looking rather frightened. "Don't worry, Mustafa," said Professor Quatermass. "I am working on the problem, and I'm expecting a breakthrough any time now." But at that very moment the mice heard the door of the church creaking open. Squeaking in panic, they all ran away to their nests to hide. Poor little Mustafa crouched in the mousetrap, trying to make himself look as small as possible and trembling with fright. A dark shadow loomed over the mousetrap, and Mustafa felt himself rising up in the air. He opened one eye just a tiny bit. A huge face was looking in at him. Mustafa closed both his eyes tight shut and buried his nose in his paws. Then he felt the mousetrap being carried out of the church and into the sunlight. The rest of the mice crept out of their nests again. They all looked at each other with dismay. "He's gone, he's gone," wailed Chrissy Mouse. "Poor little Mustafa, we will never see him again," wept Madam Mouse. "That human was Jack, the boy that I used to live with," said Madam Mouse. "I don't know what will happen to Mustafa, but I know that Jack is a kind boy. He won't hurt our friend." Madam Mouse stopped crying. "Are you sure?" she asked. "Quite sure," said Madam Mouse firmly. "Mind you, he will probably want to keep him in a cage." Madam Mouse looked sad at this, but Shay Mouse said, "Ah, to be sure, me darling, the little fellow won't be minding about it at all at all. He'll be having all his food provided, and he'll be in a fine warm place, and isn't that all he's worrying about?" "That's true," said wise old Methuselah. "So long as he's warm and well fed, Mustafa will probably be quite happy. We shall miss him, of course, but so long as he's happy, that is what really matters." Madam Mouse still looked rather sad, and Chrissy Mouse went on sniffing for quite a long time, but the others agreed that things could have been much worse. "Sure, and I'm wondering how that little yellow nut tasted," said Shay Mouse. "It did smell good, so it did." He sniffed around where the mousetrap had been in case there were any bits of peanut left. The rest of the day the mice were all very sad. Madam Mouse was worried that Mustafa would be lonely. Madam Mouse said everything he could to make her feel better, for he was getting very fond of Madam Mouse. He did not like to see her so sad and worried. Secretly he was afraid that Mustafa might not be very happy living with his 4 brothers. Madam Mouse knew they would not be unkind, but Mustafa was used to the little, lively, friendly mice of St Goran. How would he get on with 4 big, fat, white mice who did nothing all day but eat and sleep? Next morning everyone felt sad when they woke up and remembered that Mustafa had gone. "I shall go and tidy up his nest," said Madam Mouse. "Then if ever he should come back, it will be ready for him." She trotted over to the place behind the heating pipes where Mustafa had his nest. Madam Mouse gave a big squeak of surprise. "There's somebody in there!" she cried. All the mice rushed over to look. Just at that moment a little sand-coloured nose poked out of Mustafa's nest, and a sleepy little voice said, "It is so nice to be home again." And out popped Mustafa. Everyone was very surprised and very happy. "How did you get back?" asked Professor Quatermass. "When did you get back?" asked old Methuselah. "It was very, very late last night," said Mustafa. "I crept in very quietly so I wouldn't wake you all up." "But how did you get away?" asked Mouse. "Did you find a hole that I gnawed in the wire of the cage?" "What cage?" said Mustafa. "I never saw a cage." "What's a cage?" asked Chrissy Mouse. "Oh, tell us what happened, please," said old Methuselah, and everyone else stopped interrupting. So everyone else stopped interrupting, and they all sat in a circle to listen, as quiet as mice. "Well, it happened like this," said Mustafa. "The little boy carried the mousetrap into a house. He showed me to a lady. She screamed and screamed, and it really made my head ache. She screamed so loud that the little boy nearly dropped the mousetrap. Then she said, 'That's a wild mouse.' The little boy said, 'Can I keep him, Mum?' The lady shouted, 'No, no, no! Get it out of here now!' 'I don't think Jack's mother likes mice very much,' said Mouse. Methuselah frowned at him for interrupting. 'So what happened next?' he asked. 'The little boy took me out into the garden,' said Mustafa. 'He put the mousetrap down and opened the door. I ran out and I hid underneath a big green plant until he went away.' 'What did you do then?' asked Mouse. 'I hid a bit more,' said Mustafa. 'I was much too frightened to move. And then the little boy came back, and I thought he was going to catch me again.' Chrissy Mouse and Madam Mouse shuddered and squeaked. 'He had some more of those funny yellow nuts like the one that was in the mousetrap,' said Mustafa. 'He put them down by the plant I was hiding under.' 'Begorrah, and aren't you the lucky one, me darling?' said Shay Mouse. 'You got to taste them twice, so you did, and never the least bit of a nibble of them for us.' Mustafa gave a little shudder. 'I didn't dare touch them,' he said. 'I thought it might be a trick to catch me again.' 'So what happened next?' asked Mouse. 'Well, I just crouched down under a big leaf, wondering what to do, and feeling very lost. Then suddenly another mouse appeared,' said Mustafa. 'So I said hello to her, and I told her everything that happened to me. She told me her name was Mouse-Merelda, and she is one of the gypsy mice who wander the world outside.' 'Like Mousy-Moto,' said Madam Mouse. 'That's right,' said Mustafa. 'She told me she is probably his third cousin 5 times removed. When the winter comes and she needs somewhere to shelter, She said she will come to St Goran's and visit him. That will be nice, said Madame Mouse. It's always good to have company over the winter. I am sure you will all like Mouse-Meralda, said Mustapha. She is very brave and very bold, and she reminds me of the mice back home in my own country. You know, the place with all the sand and spices and the camels. We don't want to hear any more about camels, said Methuselah. Go on telling us what happened. How did you get back here? Oh, it was a very difficult journey, said Mustapha. I could never have done it without Mouse-Meralda. First, we ate some of the funny yellow nuts. They are very tasty. I wish the people in the church would have nuts with their coffee instead of biscuits. After we had eaten the nuts, we waited until it was dark. Mouse-Meralda said it would be safer then. In the daylight there are cats and dogs and hawks around. That is true, said Professor Quatermass, but the night time can be dangerous too. There are owls at night. All the mice shuddered. None of them had ever seen an owl, but they had often heard them going hoo-hoo-hoo, hoo-hoo in the dark. Mouse-Meralda told me about the owls, and I was very frightened, but she said that owls are not quite so dangerous as cats and dogs and hawks, and there aren't so many of them, said Mustapha. So anyway, we decided to travel by night, and Mouse-Meralda led me safely back here to St Goran's. I don't think I could ever have done it without her. She must be a very brave mouse indeed, said Madame Mouse. Oh yes, said Mustapha, and I shall always be grateful to her. I think all the gypsy mice are very brave, said Professor Quatermass. Just think of the dangers they face every day. I suppose they find it exciting, but it wouldn't do for me. I don't want to think about it any more, said Mustapha, not now that I am safe home again, but I do hope Mouse-Meralda will visit us when the cold weather comes. I am sure she will, said Madame Mouse, and she was right, but that's another story. So that was the story of the mousetrap, and now that you have heard it, you know that Mustapha came home safely in the end. But you must promise you won't tell anyone else how the story ends, because that would spoil it for them, wouldn't it? The end. I hope you guys enjoyed that book. It's a long one, but you can listen to as much of it or as little of it as you like anytime by probably asking your mummy or daddy to just play a little bit for you before you go to sleep. Okay, I loved reading it to you. Okay, bye.